Queridos estudiantes, decano de la Facultad de Ciencias Sociales, profesores, profesoras, académicos y estudiantes de otras carreras y de otras universidades que nos acompañan, amigos y amigas. En nombre del equipo de profesores del Programa de Antropología de la Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile, tengo el agrado de darles la bienvenida al inicio de este nuevo año académico, nuestro cuarto año como Programa de Antropología con una carrera de pregrado en la disciplina. En particular, quisiera dar la bienvenida a los estudiantes de primer año que se suman a nuestro proyecto. Este 2016 trae importantes novedades para nosotros. En primer lugar, nuestra primera promoción de estudiantes completará su ciclo de formación a nivel de licenciatura, abriéndonos a todos el desafío de trabajar en miras al ciclo profesional, momento fundamental en la formación de antropólogos que realmente puedan desplegarse con seguridad y éxito en los más amplios ámbitos laborales que elijan al terminar su proceso con nosotros. Este año, además, consolidamos nuestra planta académica con la incorporación del arqueólogo Roberto Campbell, quien, junto a otros académicos del programa, están trabajando en establecer a la arqueología como una disciplina fundante en nuestro programa y futura escuela de antropología. Además, nos encontramos ahora en la etapa final del proceso para incorporar a un académico en las áreas de antropología política y económica. Con 4 años de funcionamiento como programa, hemos visto además cómo estudiantes y profesores avanzan en el desarrollo de sus inquietudes y proyectos, enriqueciendo nuestro programa y planteando nuevos desafíos. Programas de intercambio, visitas académicas y estadías en ambas direcciones por parte de estudiantes y académicos han sido prueba de ello. En esta línea es que, por ejemplo, el año pasado tuvimos la primera versión del curso de terreno de Salud Global y Pueblos Indígenas en conjunto con la Universidad de California, San Diego, el que tendrá lugar nuevamente este segundo semestre del año 2016. En línea con el desarrollo de antropología médica en nuestro programa es que hemos creado el premio Mónica Weissner en honor a la destacada antropóloga chilena por ensayos que contribuyan al debate antropológico en procesos de salud, enfermedad y medicina. Al mismo tiempo, hemos creado nuestro laboratorio de antropología visual, el que esperamos se convierta en una plataforma de diálogo dentro y fuera de la antropología. Este año hemos creado también fondos concursables internos en antropología para la presentación en congresos por parte de nuestros estudiantes y como complemento a los terrenos de investigación en sus futuros talleres de titulación. Junto con estas novedades, confirmamos este año nuestro interés en consolidar la disciplina antropológica desde los seminarios de investigación antropológica contemporánea. Este semestre el seminario, paso el aviso, lo vamos a realizar los días miércoles a las 4:30, comenzando el próximo miércoles con una exposición por parte de Sergio Canuqueo. Están todos bienvenidos, los esperamos. Y confirmamos también nuestro interés en consolidar lo que nosotros esperamos sea una tradición, la clase inaugural, la que tiene como meta acercar a nuestra comunidad a grandes representantes de nuestra disciplina, inspirándonos en nuestro proceso formativo, así como en las labores docentes y de investigación. En esta oportunidad tenemos el privilegio de contar con la presencia del profesor Tim Ingold, y ahora les voy a dejar con el profesor Cristian Simonetti, quien introducirá al profesor Ingold. Bienvenido, Cristian.
Es increíble ver a tanta gente, excitante a la vez, y es para mí todo un honor introducir a Tim, presentarles a Tim esta tarde. Antes quisiera brevemente agradecer a los que nos apoyaron para poder realizar este evento, voy a decirlo en inglés, Center for the Intercultural and Indigenous Research, a la Vicerrectoría de Investigación y en parte al British Academy también. Tim Ingold es profesor de Antropología Social en la Universidad de Aberdeen y miembro tanto de la Academia Británica como de la Sociedad Real de Edimburgo. Luego de 25 años en la Universidad de Manchester, Tim se mudó a Aberdeen, donde estableció el departamento más joven de antropología del Reino Unido. Tim ha realizado trabajo etnográfico entre los Sami y la gente de Finlandia en Lapland y ha escrito sobre preguntas comparativas en relación al ambiente, la tecnología y la organización social en el norte circumpolar. Como también en relación al rol de los animales en la sociedad humana, sobre ecología humana y teoría evolutiva en antropología, biología e historia. Posteriormente, Tim ha explorado vínculos entre percepción, práctica y desarrollo de habilidades, en el interés de reemplazar modelos tradicionales de transmisión genética y cultural por una aproximación relacional enfocada en el desarrollo de habilidades perceptuales y de acción en contextos socioambientales de crecimiento. Estas ideas están presentadas o plasmadas en su libro The Perception of the Environment, publicado en el 2000. Y bueno, en trabajos más recientes, Tim ha seguido detrás de estas temáticas en correspondencia con otras nuevas vinculadas al estudio de la dinámica del movimiento en el caminar, la creatividad de la práctica y la línea en la escritura. Estos temas en sus libros Lines en 2007 y otros libros editados como Creativity and Cultural Improvisation con Elizabeth Hallam en el 2007, Ways of Walking con John Lee Bergkunst en el 2008 y Redrawing Anthropology en el 2011, como también su colección de ensayos titulada Being Alive en el 2011, publicada por Routledge también. Posteriormente, Tim ha dedicado su escritura y enseñanza a las relaciones entre antropología, arqueología, arte y arquitectura, lo cual desembocó en la publicación de su libro Making, publicado en el 2013. Actualmente, Tim lidera el proyecto Knowing from the Inside, Anthropology, Art, Architecture and Design, financiado por el European Research Council, y su libro más reciente es The Life of Lines, publicado en el 2015, nuevamente con Routledge. Es un placer para mí dejarlos con Tim.
Muchas gracias, and thank you very much. I am an anthropologist, and for me, anthropology is a generous, open-ended, comparative, and yet critical inquiry into the conditions and possibilities of life in the one world we all inhabit. It is generous because it is founded in a willingness to both listen and respond to what others have to tell us. It is open-ended because its aim is not to arrive at final solutions that would bring social life to a close, but rather to reveal the paths along which it can keep on going. It is comparative because it acknowledges that no way of being is the only possible one, and that for every way we find or resolve to take, alternative ways could be taken that lead in different directions. So even as we follow a particular way, the question, why this way rather than that, is always at the forefront of our minds. And it is critical because we cannot be content with things as they are. By general consent, the organizations of production, distribution, governance and knowledge that have dominated the modern era have brought the world to the brink of catastrophe. And in finding ways to carry on, we need all the help we can get. But no one, no indigenous group, no specialist science, no doctrine or philosophy already holds the key to the future if only we could find it. We have to make that future for ourselves, but that can only be done through dialogue. Anthropology's role is to expand the scope of this dialogue to make a conversation of human life itself. of life, moreover, that is lived in the habitation of one world. That we do indeed inhabit one world is, in my view, a core principle of our discipline, and it is one that we neglect at our peril. I am afraid that in practice it has all too readily been neglected, along with the challenges and responsibilities it entails, in favour of a facile appeal to plurality. It sometimes seems that anthropologists are constitutionally averse to oneness, to singularity, and likewise obsessed with the plural. Never one world, always many worlds. Once there were the many worlds of symbolic culture. Now, in the wake of the so-called ontological turn, we have the many worlds of essential being. Everyone and everything, it seems, is its own world. You name it, and there's a world for you. But what do we mean by plurality, and in what sense is plurality opposed to singularity? The question of how to reconcile the singular and the plural, or in slightly different terms, the universal and the particular, could well turn out to be the central problem of a truly philosophical anthropology. So let me offer an example. People living in the high Arctic, mainly in northernmost Canada and Greenland, know themselves and are known as Inuit. The word is a plural form derived from the singular Inuk, which means literally soul. In a modern idiom, we might suppose that every soul belongs to an individual, and therefore that the plural, Inuit, simply denotes a population of individuals. Greenland and Canada, we say, have their respective Inuit populations. We could do a census and count them up. But for the people themselves, at least traditionally, souls could not be counted or enumerated in this way. As the ethnographer Henry Stewart has noted, the plural form is most certainly not a collective designation for all the original inhabitants of the tundra Arctic. It rather connotes something like existence or the state of being animate. Most often the plural suffix, that is miut, followed a toponym, that is, or a place marker, as for example Netsilik, plural Netsiling miut, or Iglulik, plural Igluling miut. And it could be glossed as soul life going on in and around this place. So the question this raises is of how to get from one to the other, from the life of the soul, Inuk, to soul life, Inuit. Not by multiplication, or not at least in the arithmetic sense, familiar to us all from elementary school. Nor, conversely, can you get from soul life to the life of the soul by division. So call the plural a multiplicity if you must, but do not suppose it is a multiplication of the singular. For every particular life, every particular soul is not an entity sunk inexorably into itself. That is to say, it is not an object in the sense recently promulgated by advocates of so-called object-oriented ontology. In their view, everything you might care to name has its own inscrutable essence. Neither is it reducible to the more elementary particles of which it and other entities might be constituted, nor is it soluble into constructs at some superordinate level of existence. Now, admittedly, the soul is amenable neither to reduction nor to totalization, neither to undermining nor to overmining, as the object-oriented ontologists would put it. But this does not make the soul an object in itself. It is more fundamentally a movement which takes the grammatical form, not of the noun or the pronoun, but of the verb. And the most outstanding characteristic of this movement is that it carries on or keeps on going. For Inuit people, it even carries on over generations. As a grandchild, for example, an Inuit grandchild is animated by the soul of its grandparent, leading parents often to address their children as they would address their own parents, and to treat them with equivalent deference and respect. So the parent speaks to his child and says, grandfather. So the idea of early years, as though children were closer to some imaginary point of origin in a process of socialization, that notion makes no sense. Everyone, at any moment, is both older and younger than themselves. So souls, or lives, are movements, and to echo the celebrated aphorism of Heraclitus, one cannot step twice into the life of the same soul. So the question is, what is the relation between the life of the soul and soul life? Or to put it more generally, between the particular life and life itself? Is it a relation of part to whole? Well, I have nothing against the idea of life as a whole, so long as we don't think of this whole as a totality. Holism is one thing, totalization quite another, and it is vital to acknowledge the distinction between them. Totality, to my ear at least, implies addition and completion, like doing a sum in your accounts. Whether or not you consider the result to be more than, equal to, or even less than the sum of its parts, the logic of summation, of adding up, remains. But life itself is never complete, nor, as I've tried to show, can we approach it by any process of summation, whether additive or multiplicative. It's not a completion, but a continual origination. Life, as one elder from among the Wemindji Cree of northern Canada told the ethnographer Colin Scott, life is continuous birth. It is the generative potential of a world in becoming, a world that is forever worlding. So then, is the particular life a part of life as a whole? Is the life of the soul a part of soul life? And again, I have nothing against the idea of lives as parts. But then we should think of these parts not as components of an assembly, but as voices of a composition. The analogy I have in mind is that of polyphonic music, in which every voice or every instrument carries on its own voice, its own melody. Think of the tenor part in the chorus or the cello part in the symphony. In music, the relation between parts and whole is not summative. It's neither additive nor multiplicative. It is rather contrapuntal. I want to think of lives as lines in counterpoint, as movements that, even as they issue forth, are continually attentive and responsive to one another. They are, as we might say, answerable to one another, and that is a condition that carries entailments of both responsiveness and responsibility. And that's why I am averse to the notion of assembly or assemblage, as it is fashionably rendered through awkward translation from the French. The problems of translation are indeed formidable, and it is true that some of the plethora of senses that have gathered around this term assemblage do approximate to what I have in mind, but others most definitely do not. And the trouble is that by resorting to the notion of assemblage or assemblage as a catch-all, it's all too easy to obscure or gloss over a distinction that I think to be of capital importance. And this is the distinction between the kinds of work done in language with the little words and with. And is a conjunction, grammatically, and the logic of the conjunction is agglutinative. With is a preposition, and the logic of the preposition is differential. Now, contrasting the figures of the tree and the rhizome, philosopher Gilles Deleuze and psychoanalyst Félix Guattari allow them to stand respectively for filiation and alliance. So the tree is filiation and the rhizome is alliance. The rhizome, they say, is nothing but alliance. I just quote, this is what they say: the tree imposes the verb to be, but the fabric of the rhizome is the conjunction and. Now, with respect, this is grossly unfair to living trees, which, unlike their diagrammatic counterparts, grow, branch, and swerve from within the midst of things just as much as do the tangling roots of the rhizome. In the sphere of human relations, although filiation might be marked on the anthropologist's genealogical chart as a line connecting 2 points, standing respectively for parent and child, so we have the father and the son, say, and a line connecting the two. In real life, filiation is a process of becoming, in the course of which, through growing older together, the child carries on the life of its parent while progressively differentiating its own life from the life which engendered it. So filiation is not the connection of parent and child, it is the life of parent with child. And just as in musical counterpoint, parts are not components that are added to one another, but movements that carry on alongside one another, so too in the human family, lives lived in counterpoint are not and, but with. And in answering or responding to one another, they correspond. And so in place of the assemblage, as a way of talking about the multiplicity of soul life, as if it were an alliance of souls, I propose the term correspondence to connote their affiliation. So life as a whole is not the agglutinative summation, but the differential correspondence of its particulars. And it follows that the relations that make up the whole are not between, but along. The betweenness gives us the idea of interaction, a reciprocal back and forth exchange between subject positions, here and there, back and forth. The alongness of correspondence, by contrast, does not go back and forth, but side by side, like companions walking together or playing music together. And the thing about walking and playing is that they don't issue from a position, but continually pull the performer out of it. Both, as the philosopher Jan Maschlein puts it, both are practices of exposure. Exposure means out of position. Now the English language, perhaps Spanish too, you'll tell me, the English language has a beautiful word, longing, to describe the exposure of going along. We say we long for things. In longing, an imagination that lies beyond the horizon of conceptualization loops proleptically back to meet an origination that lies beyond the reach of memory, as in the cycling soul life of the Inuit. in a place that we continually strive for but never reach, a place that is as much out in the future as in the past. In a workshop we held at home at the University of Aberdeen a couple of years ago, the mathematician Ricardo Nemirovsky gave us a wonderful demonstration of what this means in practice. In a nearby park, we laid out a rope, a long rope, in the exact form of a parabola, in this shape. Its ends diverging to infinity, in practice, to where our rope ran out. We then viewed the parabola through a vertical sheet of perspex. So we held the perspex up here and looked through it, because a transparent sheet, looked through it to the rope on the grass. And we drew the line of the rope on the perspex with a felt pen. And we found that we had drawn an ellipse, like that. At infinity, the ends of the parabola had closed up. So with this demonstration in mind, let me return to the problem of universality. What can it mean to say of the one world that it is universal? And how does it relate to the particular, or to the relativity of the particular point of view? You'll surely agree that this is a central question for anthropology. I think it means that we have to think of the difference in terms of differentiation rather than diversity. Cultural differentiation, not cultural diversity. And this distinction, I believe, is critical. And one way to get at it is to reflect upon the meaning of the ground. How often have we heard it said that cultural particulars are superimposed upon the ground of a universal human nature? Well then, what is the ground? Is it, as the founder of ecological psychology, James Gibson, once put it, an underlying surface of support upon which all else rests? For Gibson, any habitable environment must be furnished with objects, much as is a floor of a room with furniture. So as chairs, tables and cupboards are set upon the floor, so trees, rocks and buildings are set upon the ground. But a moment's reflection shows that this notion of the ground is deeply paradoxical. On the one hand, if the ground is a universal surface of support for every kind of environmental object, then it should be fundamentally there before all else. Yet on the other hand, how can that be when we can only arrive at this surface by excising or cutting out every variation or particular from the environment of which it is a part, remodeling it as a piece of furniture, and then reconstructing the scene by imagining each piece to be set down upon a pre-prepared and absolutely featureless floor. This is the logic of the stage set, in which all the scenery, hills, buildings, everything is placed upon the boards. Difference in this logic is bilateral. As features distinguish themselves from the ground, so the ground distinguishes itself from its features. All difference is then detached, leaving its fragments, be they rocks or trees or buildings, scattered upon the stage like severed limbs on a battlefield. Now the stage and the fragments correspond to two aspects of indifference, and that is to what Gilles Deleuze in his book on difference and repetition calls black nothingness and white nothingness. That is, fragments are indifferent to where they lie on the stage, they could be anywhere, and conversely the stage is indifferent to what rests upon it. And the puzzle for Deleuze is this: in the real world, not on stage, but in the real world, things like rocks, trees and buildings are as much of the ground as on it. They are rooted or founded there. They partake of its substance and contribute to its texture. And yet they are readily distinguishable as the features they are. How can this be? And Deleuze's answer is that in becoming different, not in being different, but in becoming different, one thing can distinguish itself from another without the latter's, the others, distinguishing itself from the former. Imagine, for example, lifting up a bed sheet to form a crease. You've got the sheet on your bed, you lift it up, you hold it there, and there's a crease. And we register the line of the crease, we see it as something that has an existence of its own, and yet the crease is still in the sheet. It's not as though the sheet had parted company with the crease and sank back into some sort of flat homogeneity, leaving the crease line, as it were, high and dry. And so it is too with lines and the ground. The line, says Deleuze, distinguishes itself from the ground without the ground distinguishing itself from the line. That is to say, the distinction is unilateral. And to think of difference in terms of differentiation rather than diversity is to imagine the universal not as a featureless ground, a plane of commonality upon which all diversity is mounted like scenery on the stage, but as a surface that is folded and crumpled like the sheet, and for which difference is ever emergent. So every distinguishing feature is a fold in the ground. So in a life of longing, all difference arises thus, from within, in the midst of things. And it is in that sense interstitial. So it follows that the life of the soul is to soul life, particular life to life itself, as the crease is to the sheet, or as the line is to the ground, as the crease distinguishes itself from the as the crease distinguishes itself from the sheet or the line from the ground, so the particularity of the singular life distinguishes itself from the universality of life itself, without the universals distinguishing itself from the particular. And that's why I want to call the life process one of interstitial differentiation rather than of exterior agglutination. So, and this is the distinction between alliance and filiation, or between assemblage and correspondence. Perhaps just to bring it a bit down to earth, this is very abstract, I know. Perhaps you might compare it to the difference between cutting timber transversally with a saw and splitting it longitudinally with an axe. You've got some timber, you might take a saw and cut it like this, or you might take an axe and split it like this. The saw cuts the length into blocks or sections which can only be reassembled through conjunction. But the axe joins with the timber, as in its swerve it corresponds with lines of growth that were incorporated into the wood when it was part of a living tree. So the axe acts on the timber as the preposition to the noun, following the grain of the world's becoming and differentiating it, splitting it from within. Now, to us anthropologists, the ontology that gives us the ground of nature as a universal and homogeneous substrate upon which are set the fragmentary forms of cultural diversity will be immediately recognizable as the default position adopted by generations of textbooks, a position that tends to be glossed by such non-specific words as Western or modern. The Western view is that cultural diversity is superimposed upon the universal ground of nature, and we hear it from textbook after textbook. Philippe Descola, in his treatise beyond nature and culture, calls this ontology naturalism. And for Descola, naturalism is one of 4 logically possible ontological schemas that underwrite the way human beings can organize their relations with one another and with the world they inhabit and render this world intelligible. The other schemas he calls analogism, totemism, and animism. Well, this isn't the place for an extended review of Descola's arguments, but I would like to attend briefly to his account of animism, because by doing so I can add some precision to what I mean by the relation between the life of the soul and soul life, and also clarify the sense of one-worldness that follows from it. There is one characteristic of animism, Descola assures us, that everyone can accept. And this, and I quote, is the attribution by humans to non-humans of an interiority identical to their own. Now, by this he means that plants, and especially animals, are taken to be endowed with souls which enable them to act normatively and ethically as social beings, just as humans do. And against this homogeneous sea of souls common to all animate beings, there stands a diversity of exterior physical bodies that give each particular soul its executive armature and allows it to function in the world in the particular way it does. And in this regard, Descola thinks, animism is the perfect opposite of modern or Western naturalism, which gives us the diversity of forms of mental or spiritual life, or what modern people called cultures, set against the background of a homogeneous physical nature. Or in a nutshell, whereas animism is the combination of similarity of interiorities and dissimilarity of physicalities, naturalism is a combination of similarity of physicalities and dissimilarity of interiorities. Now, this all sounds very neat until you start to wonder why naturalism, in the same breath that it extols the universality of nature as against the diversity of cultures, also celebrates the boundless diversity of living kinds, that is under the concept of biodiversity, vis-à-vis the universality of the human mind or of its conscious sense of self. It looks as though what is similar and what is diverse depends on which way you look. And if naturalism can be just as well defined as the dissimilarity of physicalities and similarity of interiorities as by its opposite, then how can it any longer be distinguished from animism? Now, I don't mean to pretend that naturalism and animism are one and the same. But what we do need to understand is that compared with the similarities and dissimilarities of animism, those of naturalism are of another kind. Or in brief, naturalism's similarities are of identity rather than continuity, and naturalism's differences are of diversity rather than differentiation. When we equate similarity with identity, we assume an already divided world, populated by discrete, self-contained entities whose properties are to be compared. So a property is deemed to be universal when it is common to every entity, and it's particular when it is limited to a narrower class of entities, or perhaps even unique to a single entity. So if we take similarity to mean identity, then the universal is simply a lowest common denominator. It's what everything has in common. And the diverse particulars to be compared are assumed to have already precipitated out of the matrix of their generation. By contrast, in the world according to animism, things are not already formed, but ever forming as concentrations of vital materials and energies that are and must remain perpetually in circulation. Everything that is, or perhaps better, everything that occurs, is immersed in the flow. So it's all very well to speak with Descartes of the interiority of soul life, but this is not an interiority that is set over against the exteriority of bodies. It is rather the interiority of a life that is immanent in the world itself and that participates directly in its relations and processes. So let's call that the interiority of immanence. Quite contrary to the kind of interiority that is opposed to the physicality of the exterior world, the interiority of immanence runs seamlessly into physicality, like the singular surface of a Mobius strip, without any breach of continuity. Or consider an eddy in a stream. Can you tell what is inside the eddy from what is outside? Of course you can't, for the simple reason that the eddy is not the container of content, but the form of a movement. So every particular soul, likewise, is an eddy in the flow of soul life, a vortex that continually winds and unwinds, and a place not of rest, but of turbulence. The soul is a turbulent place. So, if the differences of animism manifesting on the plane of immanence arise as vortices in the current, well, those of naturalism have broken off from it and lie strewn upon that plane of indifference otherwise known as nature. The first kinds of differences are emergent and interstitial, the second kind are resultant and superficial. Whereas animism gives us a world of becoming, naturalism gives us a world of being. And I think it is the logic of naturalism operating from behind the scenes in Descartes' account that contrives to wrap every being into itself and so converts the generative currents of its formation into a vital agent, a soul, that is supposed to inhabit an interior divided off from the exterior world of its interactions with others. And in my call for a one-world anthropology, I want to escape the deadening impact of this logic, to release the soul from its imagined incarceration and to restore its turbulence to the circulations of life. It is to appeal not to the naturalistic dyad of identity and diversity, but to the animistic pairing of continuity and differentiation. So the universal is not a lowest common denominator at all, but a field of continuous variation, not a plane of indifference upon which diversity is overlain, but a plane of immanence from which difference is ever emergent. Well, the next stage in my argument, if you've followed it so far, is to relate the principle of interstitial differentiation to the problem of agency. I want to suggest that there is a connection between the question of how to reconcile the singular and the plural, that is, of the life of the soul with soul life, and the question of how to relate agency and patiency, or action and suffering. In fact, I think the connection is so intrinsic that these seem to me to be alternative ways of posing what is fundamentally the same problem. So let me begin by being explicit about what has been implicit in my argument all along, namely that by the life of the soul, I mean that of the person, and that by soul life, I mean social life. So we're talking about the relationship between the life of the person and social life. That is what this has all been about. The life of the person is made up of doings, of things the person does. Social life, by contrast, is what the person undergoes. So our question is really about the relation between doing and undergoing. Now, in the grammar of most Indo-European languages, there is a distinction between the active and the passive voices of the verb. The active voice is for what one does. I did this, I talked to somebody, I kicked a ball. The passive is for what one undergoes. I was kicked by somebody. Should we then think of life in the active voice or in the passive? Or should we think in terms of some kind of interplay between the two? Or more precisely, should the active be framed within the passive? Or should the passive be framed within the active? Are the things we do the callings of a life that happens to us, or are the things that happen to us called up by the things we do? Well, for those of us raised in an Indo-European linguistic environment, our usual habits of thought, which are of course conditioned, though not determined, by the grammatical categories of the languages we speak, our usual habits of thought put the agency of the person out in front as the sovereign initiator of his or her actions, as opposed to an exterior world in which these actions have effects. So I decide to do something, I'm an agent, I put the action in process and it has an effect in the world out there. And so we tend to set the agency of the particular life against the passive backdrop of life in general. But the principle of interstitial differentiation suggests that the doings of every particular life continually emerge and distinguish themselves from within the plane of immanence that is life itself. And this is to frame doing within undergoing and not the other way round. Or another way of putting this is to think of everything we do as a task, because the task is something that falls to us as responsive and responsible beings, as part of the life we undergo. It falls to me to carry out this task because of where I am. Or to revert to an earlier distinction, it is a way of corresponding with the world in which we live, rather than a way of interacting with it. And if every doing is a task, then we need to find a way of talking about agency that puts it inside undergoing. Now, with our conventional dichotomy between active and passive voices of the verb, this is very difficult to do. However, many non-European languages, as well as also Indo-European in earlier times, such as, for example, in classical Greek, many non-European languages recognized what linguists call the middle voice of the verb. Not active, not passive, but middle. And in the middle voice, agency is inside the action, inside the verb. Or as the linguist Emile Benveniste put it in a classic paper, in the middle voice, the doer achieves something that is being achieved in him. So my suggestion is that in the one world of becoming, the one world of interstitial differentiation, life is lived neither in the active nor in the passive, but in the middle voice. The particular life is not played out against the background of life itself, but emerges from its midst. Now, with life lived in the middle voice, our focus can no longer be on the essence of being. It must rather be on its ongoing generation. That is to say, our focus should not be on ontology, but on ontogeny. I get a very ontogenetic bit now, so the compliment is really welcome. Well, so carry on, that's fine. I don't like the idea of turns, but if we must have such things to indicate the transitions in our thinking, then I would wish for a turn that is not ontological, but ontogenetic. With multiple ontologies, everything or every being is its own world, so that ultimately there are as many worlds as there are beings or things. This is the reductio ad absurdum of object-oriented ontology. But with multiple ontogenies, every being or thing issues forth along its own particular path within one world of nevertheless unlimited differentiation. Or in short, ontogenesis, the growth and becoming and generation of things, of being, ontogenesis allows us to reconcile singularity and multiplicity, or agency and patiency, within one world. There is, as the philosopher Alain Badiou has put it, only one world, but it is a world that refuses any normative preconditions for existing in it, such as might be entailed in any naturalistic definition of universal humanity. How many times have we attempted to define human nature in terms of the common possession of this or that attribute? Bipedalism, tool-making, male-female pair bonding, language, symbolic thought, and so on and so forth. We've tried all sorts of different things. That these are the universal property of human nature, only to discover that there are creatures born of man and woman who lack these attributes and who consequently find themselves excluded, or at least considered less than human. So the one world we inhabit is not reserved for what the anthropologist Donald Brown has called universal people, or UP for short, who all share the same behavioural traits. It is rather a world of ever-emergent difference which admits no boundaries of inclusion or exclusion. And I believe that anthropology should be fighting intellectually and politically for the recognition of this kind of world. So the question is, what should we call it? In 1908, the American philosopher William James delivered the Hibbert Lectures at the University of Oxford, which was subsequently published under the title A Pluralistic Universe. And James's proposed solution to the problem of the one and the many was to insist that the multiverse, as he called it, is simultaneously both singular and plural, for the reason that its oneness is never absolutely complete. It is strung along, said James, not rounded in and closed. So regardless of the part or element on which you might choose to focus, at whatever level of exclusiveness or inclusiveness, there is always an overflow of relations. Wherever you are, there are further connections to be drawn, maybe direct, maybe through intermediaries. And in the drawing of these connections, even in their interpenetration, things lose nothing of their particularity. Now, much more recently, the anthropologist Arturo Escobar has returned to the same idea, but in the context of contemporary geopolitics, in order to draw an explicit contrast with the one world of corporate globalization. epitomized in the celebrated logo of the World Bank with its perfect gridlocked sphere, shorn of life, elements and people, this is indeed a world that is rounded in and closed, to use James's terms, and in which everything there is has been reduced to liquid commensurability. What Escobar, following James, calls the pluriverse could not be more different. It might be described, writes Escobar, as a process of planetarization articulated around a vision of the earth as a living whole that is always emerging out of the manifold biophysical, human and spiritual elements and relations that make it up. So in calling for a one-world anthropology, I'm proud to follow in the footsteps of such distinguished thinkers as James and Escobar. And yet I would still enter one qualification, and it goes back to my comparison of the conjunction and the preposition as ways of joining. The Jamesian pluralistic universe is multiply connected, and yet its connections are conjunctive and not prepositional. They join things externally, on the outside. Things are with one another in many ways, wrote James, but nothing includes everything or dominates over everything. The word "and" trails along after every sentence. Something always escapes. Indeed, the Jamesian multiverse is rhizomatic in every conceivable way. It is and, the very model of an assemblage. James was thinking about these things a century, or a bit less than a century, before Deleuze hit on the same idea. And yet the fact that James starts this quote with, and only then resorts to and, is revealing. Let me just read it again, what James said. Things are with one another in many ways, but nothing includes everything or dominates everything. The word and trails along after every sentence. So he starts with and ends with and perhaps he would have liked it both ways. Be that as it may, the multiverse that I propose is unambiguously with, and not and. It is prepositional, not conjunctive, and its plurality or multiplicity arises not from chains of exterior connection, of things strung along, but from the cascades of interstitial differentiation by which the earth as a living whole, to use Escobar's words, is continually emerging. And it is to the one-worldness of the whole, I believe, that anthropology must remain committed. But for this very reason, I have my doubts about the anthropological propensity always to want to put standpoints within their social, cultural, and historical contexts. Anthropology is obsessed with putting everything in its context, and this is like laying them to rest, putting them to bed, so that we no longer have to engage with them directly. Go to bed and be quiet, we say to the child, who actually is simply trying to have his or her existence acknowledged, not to be understood. The child does not want to be understood in context. The child wants to be heard. Yet, so embedding things in context implies an already completed socialization. Yet if we open up this moment of socialization through a reverse movement of disembedding or disinterment, it turns out to be nothing less than the process of social life or soul life itself. What we had closed off and buried by resort to context embraces all we should acknowledge. Ontogeny, the skeleton in the ontological cupboard, needs to be brought out and restored to presence. And with it, practices and processes of education I think, long and unjustly marginalized in an anthropology that remains obsessed with the shapes and forms of mature thought. Practices and processes of education should be restored to the centrality they deserve in our discipline. And we can then see that every particular life is both an open-ended exploration of the possibilities of being that our one world affords, and a contribution to its ongoing formation, that is, to its worlding. And it is in this sense a never-ending quest for an answer to the question of what being human or what living in this world means. Social life is lived in the quest for an answer, not in the enactment of its solution. And responding to the question, we respond to one another, that is, we correspond. And in this, we do not look out from a standpoint, but long for one that is forever beyond our grasp. So life is a question to which there is no answer, but in this one world of ours, we are all tasked with looking for it. And it's in the search that all social life is lived. And it is just as well that there is no final solution, for that indeed would put an end to us all. Thank you very much. Get myself wired up. One. That's it? Okay.
Thank you so much. Por favor, can you hear me? ¿Me pueden escuchar? Sí. Muchas gracias, Tim, por la charla. Would you like to answer the question from the participants? Voy a pasar el micrófono. Como tengo el micrófono, me voy a dar el lujo de hacer una primera pregunta. La voy a hacer en inglés para que sea más claro. So my question, I have the privilege to ask the first question. I have the microphone. Taking the privilege, I want to ask you about the image. And I want to know, ask if you could tell us the story behind the image, but also ask whether it holds somehow the legacy. And I was thinking of how anthropology asks questions. If we compare the image with the Apollo 13 image of the globe, and this title, Erikson has asking big questions in small places, and whether instead of doing something like this, holding the world around, we do it like from within.
Okay. Okay. For some reason, there's only half the picture there, but I think you've all seen the whole one. I don't actually know much about this. The man in the picture is somebody called John Gower, and it comes from a manuscript that he wrote in the 14th century, I believe. The Earth that he's shooting at has got the elements of fire. The water is down below. That's the bit you can't see, and then there's earth and fire. So there are three of the four classical elements marked there, and he's shooting an arrow at it. I have absolutely no idea why he's shooting an arrow at it, but I think it's a very beautiful image of the world, made up out of the classical elements. It is, if you like, a cosmos in the classical sense, and the cosmos is a world that we actually inhabit and experience. When you're sitting in the world and you look up and there's the sky, and you look down and there's the earth, and the fire is burning in your hearth, and there's water to drink, and this is the world we actually know from our lived experience. Whereas, of course, the world as shown from the Orbiter spacecraft, or the world in the World Bank corporate logo, is a world in which there is no place to be in that world. It's a world that excludes human beings. Sir Martin Heidegger, when he first saw pictures of the Earth beamed from Lunar Orbiter 1, I think in 1966 or thereabouts, found the image terrifying. And he said that there's nowhere for anyone to be. If this is the world, there's nowhere for anyone to be in it. I think the world that Gower is shooting at there is a very homely world. It's a world actually that we feel we could inhabit, and that's the kind of world that I think in anthropology we should be trying to understand and promote in some ways, because everything in the powerful forces in our world are all pushing in the opposite direction. Yeah.
Thank you for a very thought-provoking lecture, but I'm going to ask you this in Spanish. La pregunta es bien sencilla. Buena parte de su presentación tiene que ver con, como yo lo entiendo, corrígese si la entendí mal, cómo se organiza la vida social, ¿verdad? Cómo adopta forma la vida social. Y en particular la pregunta mía tiene que ver con qué lugar le asigna usted o qué importancia le asigna al conflicto o al desacuerdo dentro de la sociedad, porque tal como usted presenta, la manera en que se organiza todo parece siguiendo un cierto patrón bastante armónico, habla de música, todo, pero ¿qué ocurre con algo que es bastante universal como el conflicto, ¿verdad? Que destruye, impone cosas, domina a otros?
Yes, yeah. A good question, which is often put to me in a rather critical way, and say that what I presented is something awfully harmonious, in which everybody's getting on with everybody else, and there's no conflict and there's no disagreement. To which I would respond that well, firstly, for there to be ruptures, for there to be agreements, there have first to be continuities. You can't actually build a world out of fragments. The world you build has to be built out of paths, out of lines. Now it's true that those lines can be broken, but it's also true that it's the forces of things pulling in different directions that actually hold things often together. So one image you could have, and that I've used in my own work, is the image of the knot. When you tie a knot, a simple knot, out of two strings, say, when you're tying your shoelaces, the knot holds together because you've pulled those strings tightly in contrary directions. Those opposed forces have set up a friction between the threads, which actually holds the form in place. So that we don't have to think of disagreements or contrariness as in any sense destructive. It can actually be what holds it together. And the same goes for harmony. It's interesting that it's a wonderfully rich word that comes from ancient Greek. It includes inside it the words arm, A-R-M, from which are derived all our words for art and artistry, but also arms, and of course arms can be weapons. So inside the notion of harmony is not just pure togetherness, pure we-ness, but also contrariness as well. And one of the best images that the Greeks themselves used to explain harmony was that of a rope. When you tie a rope, it's often the rope itself might be made of several strands, and each of those strands are made out of several strands. And the rope holds together because the twist of the component strands is contrary to the twist of the strands in the rope as a whole. So that if one tries to untwist, it simply twists out the other. And that's a beautiful image, actually, of harmony and of how what we might think of as contrary forces, as tensions, as disagreements, actually are what holds the whole thing together. That's my answer.
También una pregunta sencilla. ¿Aló? ¿Se escucha? Una pregunta sencilla y siguiendo la línea del compañero y también la metáfora de los nudos. ¿Qué pasa cuando una de esas líneas se tira con mucha fuerza? Y por tanto, esta armonía se quiebra un poco y suceden eventos como dictaduras, golpes de Estado y cosas por el estilo. Parece que toda esta armonía se disuelve en algo que es realmente doloroso y que marca a fuego países, personas, sociedades enteras. ¿Qué podrías decir a eso?
There's a second question that they've introduced saying this is just a very simple question. Anyway, the simple questions are the really difficult ones, and I can't give a simple answer to that one. It's also the question about how do you explain pain, for example. What happens when things are pulled in such different directions? For example, in the growth of a body, with a diseased body, perhaps that patterns of growth and movement in the body are out of joint, and you experience that as a pain, and that's experienced as almost a difficulty, if not impossibility, to keep on going. And I think I would want to put it like that, to think not in terms of splitting objects into pieces, but in terms of the possibility or impossibility to keep on going. And what has, through history, what has always brought the greatest catastrophes have been final solutions. You know, every so often a powerful ruler says they've got the final solution for us human beings, and the results have been absolutely catastrophic, as we know very well. And this has happened throughout the course of history, and it's broken down. What we need to fight for then, and this is my understanding of anthropology, is that we should not be looking for solutions to the problem of social life. We should be looking for ways in which we can keep the show on the road, keep things going. We don't have to keep things staying the same, but so where there is rupture, where there is conflict, we need as people who find themselves in conflict, people who find themselves in terrible conflict situations, do all they can, if they can, and if they're still alive, to wriggle through somehow, to find a crack, to find a way in which somehow they and their families can keep the show on the road, keep things going. And we should, in a sense, be following those paths, those lines, see where we can get through the cracks, rather than focusing on the blocks themselves.
Gracias, Tim, por la presentación. Quería saber si el paradigma de los derechos humanos, los derechos fundamentales de los humanos, es compatible con esta idea de One World Anthropology, porque obviamente los derechos humanos también apuntan al individuo, y entonces, ¿dónde queda esa relación entre persona y vida social?
Okay, another simple question. As you know, anthropologists, we all subscribe superficially to notions of human rights, but as we know, anthropology has had a great deal of problem with the human rights because of the way it's grounded in a particular conception of the human individual, which in many ways has been, you could say, is responsible for many of the problems that we then need to have recourse to human rights and notions of human rights to address. I would want to shift the focus from rights to responsibilities. And I think maybe what we should be calling for in anthropology is a discourse of human responsibilities rather than a discourse of human rights. And the thing about responsibilities is that they depend on responsiveness, which I do think is a basic way of being in the world, that we respond, we attend to others, we are sensitive to their needs, and we respond as best we can. And for the most part, that's what social life is. It's about having sometimes an intuitive sense about what others need, and doing our best to respond to those in ethical ways. And so the trouble with the discourse of human rights is that it does set people up against one another. It does lead people to say, this, I claim my right, as against whatever else. And it's a logic of disconnection, of division. And I think, yes, I would appeal for a logic of human responsibilities in place of that, and I think that maybe is the way to go.
Quería preguntar, quizás soy la excepción, no sé, pero yo vengo de las artes visuales y me gustaría saber qué rol atribuye a la creación artística en este One World o en esta interconexión global.
I'm thinking more and more that there's a close connection, even almost an identity, between anthropology and art. Not thinking of art as objects of art or works of art, but as practices of art. And in the sense that you could almost define art in the way I defined anthropology to start off with, a generous, open-ended, comparative and yet critical inquiry into the conditions and possibilities of being in the one world we inhabit. That would not be a bad definition of art. And it would be saying that artists too are intervening in the world, are trying things out in a speculative way to think, the question is, how should we live? That is the question that we're all trying to address one way or another, and I think artists are trying to address that, and I think anthropologists are. And the only thing I want to add to that is that the reasons that I think make arts practice and anthropology very good companions are also the reasons why I think that arts practice combines very badly with ethnography, and the reasons why I think anthropology and ethnography are separate. You try and combine art and ethnography, and you get bad art and bad ethnography, I think, because ethnography is committed to descriptive accuracy, to understanding the world as it is. And that's a good thing, but it doesn't easily combine with art's commitment to speculative inquiry and experimentation. So the reason why I do think that art and anthropology go very well together, but I think that also really puts us on the spot in anthropology to clarify our position vis-à-vis ethnography.
Gracias, Tim, por la charla. Mi pregunta es un tanto complicada. Yo entiendo la conferencia y el título como un ataque, no sé si un ataque es la palabra, pero es una crítica directa al giro ontológico de la antropología. Y desde esa crítica al giro ontológico y desde mi propia experiencia investigativa con minorías étnicas en el sur de Chile, me parece que hay una dimensión del giro ontológico que quizás puede ser políticamente muy importante, que es básicamente la libre determinación de los pueblos y la total autonomía en base a que son incognoscibles o inconmensurables desde nuestra propia perspectiva, que es una propuesta de una antropología monista, aunque sea a partir de esta idea de interstitial differentiation, podría conllevar riesgos a esta suerte de propuesta de autonomía frente a los pueblos que están en una subalternidad total o en vulnerabilidad frente a las relaciones de poder. ¿Qué te parece?
Yeah, I agree that these are very sensitive matters, and I've come across similar issues in the north among Sami people where I've worked. And the difficulty is this: that in the logic of the contemporary nation state, which is the framework in which most contemporary indigenous people are operating politically, in order to express your difference, you have to express it in the language of homogeneity. That is to say that the leaders of indigenous minorities are finding that they have to, in order to be heard, because they are doing their politics within the framework of a nation state, they're having to express their difference in terms of ethnic diversity. Sometimes this is done by appeal to ancestry or language or land or whatever it might be. The consequence of that is ever-increasing division, ever-increasing fragmentation. It certainly happened in the Sami case. That makes it more and more difficult for them to operate together, because they're saying we are different. We here we're different from that lot there, and they're continually slicing themselves up, and that actually weakens their position vis-à-vis the state. Now, of course, that is a problem, and I don't actually know the way out, because the alternative is to go against the logic of the state itself, and this is not something that most any indigenous people really have it in their power to do. So the question is whether to play a kind of realpolitik and say, well, this is the situation, and so we'll just try and to define ourselves vis-à-vis others in terms that the nation state can understand, or we'll try to overthrow that logic of the territorial state. I don't know the answer to it, but it's important, I think, to recognize the paradox, because in so many cases I certainly felt with the Sami that indigenous leaders were almost betraying their people, betraying the sense that the people had of belonging to the land they lived on, by appealing instead to some concept of ethnic diversity, which did not accord with deep down indigenous understandings of what it meant to belong to community and belong to the land. So it's a problem. I don't have the answer.
First of all, I would like to apologize. I couldn't hear everything about what you said about this, so maybe you already said this. And secondly, thank you for this amazing presentation. I really like how you were able to connect language with this World Anthropology. And it's related to language that I want to ask you something about this middle voice that you spoke about. I would like to know where was used or when was used this middle voice, and if there is an equivalent in English about it or a way to relate to this middle voice.
Okay, yeah, thank you. The middle voice is, my understanding is it's linguistically quite a technical matter, and I'm almost out of my depths with it, but my understanding is that the middle voice is quite common among many, for example, among Native American languages, particularly. I don't know about Native American languages in South America, but I do know that in a number of Native American First Nations languages in North America, particularly those which have an ergative structure, where they don't have the subject predicate, subject verb object, SVO structure. I mean, the classic structure that we're used to in modern contemporary Indo-European languages is subject verb object. The boy kicked the ball. And in ergative languages, which as I understand are very common among North American First Nations people, the boy in that example would be his kicking. The boy is inside, so you'd have to write something like the boy kicking with a hyphen. It's almost impossible to do in English, but it's like saying that I am at any moment what I am doing. I am inside my speaking now. I'm not somebody who stands outside as an agent and decides to speak and then sets that action in motion. I'm inside the action. So that's common as I understand it, in not universal in the sense of you don't find it in all languages, but in a great many. And I understand also that in classical times you found this middle voice in Indo-European languages such as Greek. And then for some reasons, which I don't fully understand, it sort of fell out of use. I really don't know why, but according to linguists it did. And in English, and probably in Spanish too, you could probably find examples that approximate to it. And one example I was thinking of, I'm not sure whether this works or not, I fell asleep. When you try to fall asleep, you never do. But then somehow you find you have done, and you who's falling asleep just now are inside that process of falling asleep. So I fall asleep might be an example of the middle voice in English. Perhaps I lost my way. Things of that sort. You could bring it in, but I'm not quite sure whether it's exactly right. It's an interesting question. You need to ask a linguist too.
Thank you so much. Muchas gracias, Tim, por esta excelente charla inaugural. Es realmente un placer tenerte aquí, así que les pido un gran aplauso.